Broadcast across the nation to an audience of 300 million, a sitting representative leveled the heaviest accusation possible right on the congressional floor, branding the president a taker of human life. It was a gamble that took exactly 14 days to backfire as Donald Trump threw down the gauntlet, challenging Representative Ilhan Omar to look him in the eye and say it again. Stripped of teleprompters, shielded by zero staffers, and offered no escape hatches, she bit hard on the hook. Stepping into the studio that evening, she was convinced this clash would cement her political legacy. Before the cameras finally powered down, however, the only thing echoing through her live microphone would be dead air. The stage was set for a primetime showdown featuring merely a pair of chairs, a lone moderator, and a total blackout on commercial interruptions. Issued at the break of dawn in capitalized letters on Truth Social, the former president's invitation carried zero hints of an apology. Within 60 minutes, the Congresswoman locked in her attendance. Hitting the ground running, she bypassed any pleasantries. Pitching her voice to the exact piercing frequency she favored in the Capitol, Omar immediately laid her cards on the table. "The reason I took this seat is crystal clear," she announced. 14 days ago, I pinned the label of a life taker on this individual. I stood by every syllable, and I am here to deliver the exact same message right to his face, a life taker." Extending her hand across the divide, she took aim. "Because this commander deployed federal personnel into our local streets like a hostile occupying force, people are in the ground," she declared. "Because he paints targets on the backs of families who share my background, instead of treating them as citizens, lives have been lost." Dragging the audio equipment a few inches closer, she doubled down. Standing right on the House floor, he threw the Minnesotan Somali community under the bus for crimes we had zero part in, framing us as state-pillaging thieves and pirates. Yet when I finally found the spine to brand him the threat to life and the fabricator he actually is, the American public clutched their pearls. Well, I bypassed the shock phase years ago. Having watched this politician spin tall tales for 10 years straight, the only novelty today is that I am delivering the verdict in person. Keeping her foot on the gas, she kept the hits coming. Working a rally crowd, this man referred to an elected congressional representative as trash, trash. While a massive audience chanted demands to deport me back to Somalia, he just soaked up the applause, lifting not a single finger to shut the hostility down. During a State of the Union address meant to project national unity, he utilized his platform to smear Somali Americans as criminals and pirates. Turning her sights back to her opponent, she delivered her closing argument. Therefore, sitting a mere 3 feet away, I will gladly repeat that he is a deceiver and a fatal danger. Because an administration that stays tight-lipped about this kind of behavior is the only entity more hazardous than the man sitting across from me. Crossing her arms, she leaned back, signaling her turn was over. Suspended right in the center of the broadcast, those heavy accusations lingered. Racist, liar, fatal threat, she stacked them up like a defensive perimeter, daring the other side of the stage to try and breach it. Grasping her strategy is crucial here. This was a familiar playbook for Omar. Firing off rapid, unapologetic, heavy-handed labels on camera was her bread and butter. 9 times out of 10, the tactic worked like a charm. She lobs the grenade, the target scrambles for cover, the morning shows hit replay, and she controls the narrative. An absolute meltdown from Trump was what she banked on. Everyone tuned in was bracing for fireworks. Expected to fly off the handle and hand over a viral soundbite, the same politician who famously interrupted Hillary Clinton with threats of prison time was supposed to lose his cool. He flipped the script entirely, anchored to his chair with one hand resting casually on the armrest. He displayed zero agitation, flashed no arrogant smiles, and kept his mouth shut. Handing the media zero usable material, he just let the clock tick. 4 seconds of uninterrupted silence. 5, 6. As reporters paused their typing and the moderator fidgeted, Omar shot a split-second glance at her opponent, resembling a prize fighter who lands a haymaker only to watch the other guy absorb it without blinking. 7 consecutive seconds. Allowing the vacuum to stretch for a full 7 seconds, Trump finally lifted a single finger, just enough to pump the brakes on the moderator's attempt to intervene. "Are you done?" he questioned, his volume dialed all the way down. It wasn't the polished calm of a seasoned diplomat, but the street-smart patience of a Queens native. It was the tone of an operator in zero rush, accustomed to facing down far heavier hitters across the table. Good. That was really something. Really something. He let that specific word hang in the air. For anyone keeping track of history who remembered how the Congresswoman once brushed off the tragedy of September 11th, that word dropped like an anvil. Raising my voice at you is not on my agenda today, Congresswoman. Snagging a viral clip is what brought you here. A fact plain as day to everyone watching, but I am refusing to hand it over. Adjusting his position, Trump laid out his countermove. Before we dive into the deep end, I plan to toss a very simple question your way instead. Stationed in the third row of the studio audience, a woman kept her hands neatly folded. Margaret Dwyer was her given name. A 68-year-old resident of Staten Island. Catching a bus long before the sun came up, she arrived wearing a simple navy garment and a marital band sitting on her right hand. A quarter of a century prior, on the exact morning, officials knocked on her door to say Thomas Dwyer of Engine 54, Ladder 4, Battalion 9 was buried under the North Tower. She had shifted that ring from her left hand. Political theater was not what drew Margaret to the studio. She showed up for a reckoning over 6 specific words. Some people did something. And resting exactly 30 feet away was the politician who coined that phrase. Pin this detail, as Margaret's presence would anchor the entire evening. Staring a hole through Omar, Trump opened his ledger. Back in 2012, before you secured a seat in Congress, you hopped on social media and claimed Israel had hypnotized the world, begging the heavens to wake people up to their evil doings. Anyone can verify it. The words are still up. Taking a calculated beat, he pressed on. Fast forward to 2019, when pressed on why the Capitol backs Israel, you fell back on your own phrasing and claimed it was all about the Benjamins, baby. Cash, that is what you insisted drove our foreign alliances. Trump sized her up the way an auditor inspects cookbooks. Pinning the anti-Semitic label on you wasn't a job I had to do, Congresswoman. Nancy Pelosi, your own Speaker of the House, handled that for me. Calling you out by name, she released a formal statement of condemnation. Dragging you in front of the cameras, your own political brass forced an apology out of you. Drafting Resolution 241, the United States House of Representatives specifically condemned your prejudiced rhetoric. Leaning back into the cushions, Trump framed the reality. So let's get everyone at home on the exact same page regarding what we are looking at. Because of her remarks regarding the Jewish community, this politician's own squad, not the conservative opposition, had to push a disciplinary resolution through the House. Her own leader put her on blast, and her own handlers made her eat crow on national television. Spreading his hands, he delivered the punchline. Yet this is the exact same individual sitting an arm's length away right now, labeling me a bigot, calling me a vessel of hate, and branding me a life-taker. Flashing a cynical half smile, he shook his head. It's the kind of smirk signaling that a fiction writer would throw this plot out for being too unbelievable. Yet this is the hand we are dealt. Refusing to crack, Omar fired right back. Allow me to peel back the curtain on my real background, she retorted. Lacking a word of English, I stepped foot in this country at 12 after burning 4 years of my youth inside a refugee camp. And every single dart this guy throws at the board traces back to one root cause. I am a black Muslim woman invading spaces where men of his demographic believe they hold the exclusive lease. Locking eyes with the broadcast lens, she maintained her stride. The unpatriotic smears, the prejudice claims, the deportation chants it's a recycled playbook. Single out the woman who breaks the mold and paint her as public enemy number one. Her heaviest armor went up. It was a defensive posture so broad that most critics usually wave the white flag rather than test its durability. But tonight, that armor shattered in roughly 15 seconds. Incorporating live feedback from the gallery, the setup afforded 3 minutes per speaker on a hot mic. Yielding the floor to a gentleman in the fifth row, the production team didn't select a conservative firebrand or a cable news talking head. Abdi Hassan took the floor. Clocking in at 55 years old, this Somali American had navigated the identical refugee circuits and endured the same waiting game as the Congresswoman, arriving stateside in the exact same decade. Keeping the lights on at a Cedar Avenue grocery store in Minneapolis was how he made his living for 19 years. The cadence of his English proved he had paid a steep price for every syllable he mastered. Since her staff actively insulates her from reality, I need the representative to absorb this straight from my mouth, Hassan declared. Squaring his shoulders, he faced her. I carry both identities. I am Somali, and I am American. Every morning at 4 for 19 consecutive years, I have flipped the sign on my storefront, paying every dime of tax I owe. I have never once begged this system for a handout I didn't sweat for. He kept his tone dead level. It was the restraint of a citizen who had spent decades learning to fly under the radar. Then the embezzlement hit our streets. Exploiting the nutrition program, actors within our own circles slapped our community's name on a scheme that stole $1 billion from the nation that took us in. He let the silence work for him. Remaining dead silent, you lifted no fingers, Congresswoman. Refusing to step up and tell our people we possessed higher standards, you took a pass on calling out the rot. Instead, you hit the TV circuit to claim society was just picking on us. Flipping our collective humiliation into your own personal flak jacket, you played the angle. Shaking his head in quiet disgust, Hassan pressed the issue. Today, the folks next door look at me sideways. Tellers at the bank ask me to dig out a second ID. Patrons I served faithfully for 15 years vanished from my aisles. That is the real-world toll the fraud took on the working folks who stayed behind the counter. Not on you. Refusing to break eye contact, he delivered a cold truth. Monopolizing the microphone at elite fundraisers, you claim to be the voice of the Somali people. Yet in 19 years, you haven't crossed my threshold a single time to ask what the neighborhood actually needs. You love talking about us, Congresswoman, but you refuse to talk to us. When Hassan resumed after a brief pause, the stoic armor in his voice fractured. What bled through the crack wasn't rage, it was bone-deep exhaustion. Buying into the promise of this country is the reason I packed my bags. I bought into the idea that paying your dues and putting in an honest day's work guaranteed a fair shake. And for 19 years, the system delivered on that promise. But the second $1 billion evaporated under our banner, the politician elected to watch our backs hit the airwaves to play the victim card. We were not victims, Congresswoman. We were humiliated and dripping with shame. What we required was a leader to stand in the trenches and condemn the thievery, not someone pointing fingers at the public for daring to notice the crime. He shook his head in resignation. When the heat got turned up, you slapped a protecting the community label on what was nothing more than a self-preservation tactic. Having survived the exact same camps you did, I can spot the difference a mile away. Taking his seat, the floor was his no more, but Omar's shield was completely vaporized. It wasn't chipped, it was erased. Because a right-wing strategist didn't dismantle her narrative. a local grocer hailing from her own turf, a man who walked in her exact shoes but forged a totally different moral compass, pulled the rug out from under her. Down in the third row, the Staten Island widow with the displaced wedding band watched Abdi Hassan sit down. Hailing from opposite ends of the American experience, these two citizens were bound by a shared grievance. A political opportunist had been hijacking their pain without ever bothering to take their pulse. Letting the dust settle, Trump held his fire. Refusing to step on Hassan's profound moment, he let the air out of the room. He made absolutely sure Omar swallowed the bitter pill of what just unfolded. Leaning in, the former president shifted his gears. His delivery hardened, going flat and cold. The concrete toughness of his old stomping grounds took the wheel, the exact frequency that drew sneers from the elite coasts, but resonated like gospel in the heartland. Taking this route wasn't on my original itinerary, Trump stated. Keeping the debate sanitized and focused strictly on the books was my game plan. But considering you hopped on a national broadcast to brand me a life-taker twice, the gloves are officially off. We are going to flip through every page of your history now. Because an undeniable trend exists, Congresswoman, and the American public is getting a front row seat tonight. Raising a solitary index finger, he initiated the audit. September 11th, 2001. The oxygen seemed to get sucked right out of the studio. The weight that date carries for the folks in this audience is something you are fully aware of. And you know exactly what it means to the lady sitting right down there in the front, locking his gaze onto Margaret Dwyer. Trump pointed her out. Broadcasting into living rooms across the nation, cameras caught a 68-year-old woman maintaining absolute composure, a ring resting on the wrong hand. Engine 54 of the FDNY was where her husband, Thomas Dwyer, punched his clock. Marching up the stairs of the North Tower that Tuesday morning, he never made the trip back down. Leaving two boys and a widow behind, his locker gear scented their Staten Island home for 12 solid months post-tragedy. Trump pivoted his attention back to his opponent, and then there's you, standing at a political fundraiser with hot mics catching every syllable. You summed up the massacre that robbed that woman of her husband using a handful of words. Some people did something. He allowed the repulsive quote to marinate. Some people did something. Shaking his head, he called her on the carpet. Some people is a gross miscalculation, Congresswoman. It was a coordinated cell of 19 terrorists. We have every name on file, every face identified, and every flight manifest secured. Nearly 3,000 Americans took their final breaths that sunrise. And strapping your exact quote to his chest, Nicholas Harros, a man whose mother was buried in that rubble, stood at ground zero. He demanded the country wake up and see exactly how a sitting lawmaker valued his mother's violent end. Something. That is the price tag you slapped on it. Something. Unleashing the full gravity of the insult upon the room, he held nothing back. Glued to her seat in the third row, Margaret Dwyer barely twitched. On the darkest day imaginable, this Staten Island resident had relocated her jewelry from left to right. But a rigid set of her jaw betrayed the intense relief of finally hearing someone broadcast the agonizing reality she had shouldered in the shadows for a quarter century. Because here is the core blind spot Omar suffered regarding her casual phrasing. Downgrading the severity of a terrorist attack was only half the crime. Treating 9/11 as a mere grammatical bridge to pivot the spotlight back onto her own grievances was the real sin. Mentioning the slaughter of 3,000 citizens with the same offhand tone someone uses to complain about traffic on their way to a meeting, and the families who bore the brunt of that morning, people cut from the same cloth as Margaret, decoded that message loud and clear. They watched an elected official reduce their eternal nightmare into a disposable footnote. Throwing up a second finger, Trump kept the pressure cooking. Minneapolis, January 2024. Assuming the language barrier would act as a shield, you took the mic in a room packed with Somali Americans and spoke in your native tongue. Leaning closer, he went for the jugular. Anyone with an internet connection can pull the receipt. The tape is public. You stated flat out, the U.S. government will do what we ask it to do. Uttered in your own voice, addressed to your own demographic, dictating terms to our sovereign nation. Dropping his pitch, he laid out the betrayal. You raised your right hand and took a sworn pledge, Congresswoman. Defending the constitutional republic of the United States was the assignment, not swearing fealty to Mogadishu, Puntland, or Somalia. Yet you waltzed into an auditorium and promised a crowd that the federal government bows to them, not in their capacity as Americans, but strictly as Somalis occupying our soil. Trump shook his head in slow disbelief. Reviewing that exact footage, even Elon, a phenomenal intellect, a really tremendous guy, suggested it crossed the line into outright treason. I'm quoting him, not me. But rest assured, a massive chunk of the electorate was nodding their heads in agreement. A third finger joined the tally. Following the money trail is always my favorite part of the job. Settling back into his chair, Trump adopted the relaxed posture of a man watching the evidence do his heavy lifting. Milking the working class, your political machine raked in the cash. Nurses, school teachers, folks dropping 10 or 20 bucks into the till, skipping meals just to fund your ambitions because they bought the hype. Taking a calculated breath, he closed the trap. And you scooped up $2.9 million of that grassroots cash and funneled it directly into your husband's consultancy firm, Tim Minette, the E Street Group. 50 cents of every dollar your campaign burned went straight into your spouse's pockets, half the pot. All while his previous wife was sitting in front of a judge testifying that he wrecked their marriage to chase you. Staring down the barrel of the camera lens, Trump delivered the kill shot. Having navigated the corporate battlefield with massive success for decades, take my word for it. When an executive takes shareholder capital and routes it into their partners' bank accounts, consulting isn't the term we use in the boardroom. We reserve a very specific legal definition for that kind of maneuver. And there isn't a soul watching this broadcast who doesn't know exactly what word I'm hinting at. A cynical, biting laugh rippled through the studio audience. The kind of gritty reaction that erupts when the elephant in the room finally gets called out. And just as an aside, Trump tossed in, expertly surfing the wave of laughter and fueling the momentum. Getting caught with her hand in the cookie jar, she had to submit revised financial disclosures because she initially pegged her net worth at $30 million. $30 million, only to backtrack and claim, my mistake, it's actually south of $100,000. $100,000. Missing the mark by $29.9 million isn't a clerical glitch. Congresswoman, that's an entirely different tax bracket. And yet you expect the American public to trust your moral calculus regarding who is a fatal danger and who isn't. The laughter spiked even louder. Let's tally the final score, Trump summarized. Brushed off 9/11 as something, promised a foreign-aligned crowd they held the leash on our government, and lined her husband's business accounts with $3 million of donor money. Took a public lashing from her own colleagues over prejudiced slurs, and just watched a grocer from her own backyard tell her she threw them to the wolves. Throwing his palms to the ceiling, he unleashed his signature gesture of exasperated disbelief, and this very individual parked herself in the most hallowed legislative chamber in human history. Pointing a finger in righteous anger, she screamed at the sitting president, labeling him a taker of lives. Slowly rotating his head, Trump nailed the coffin shut. Sitting across from the most ruthless negotiators on the planet, I've closed deals in a lot of tough rooms, Congresswoman. But let me drop some truth on you. I have never witnessed an individual lugging around a resume as toxic as yours muster the sheer gall to point the finger at someone else and shriek. That requires a staggering amount of nerve. But when you pair nerve with zero judgment, all you get is static. And tonight, 60 million Americans are finally realizing that your entire political brand is nothing but empty noise. Here is the tactical reality of the moment. Throwing the heavy murderer label, Omar had fired her best shot. Systematically dissecting her record, Trump exposed the entire grift. The cash grabs, the Somalia pandering, the 9/11 dismissal, the prejudice, he laid it all bare, using her own quotes to convict her on national television. A working-class guy from her own neighborhood testified that she exploited their identity while ignoring their cries for help. Backed into a corner, the representative had exactly one bullet left in the chamber. Cutting off the moderator, Omar went on the offensive. "You want to put judgment on trial?" she snapped, her tone dripping with venom. "Watching a mob storm the Capitol like it was primetime entertainment? You've racked up 2 impeachments and a slate of indictments. Playing the moral arbiter from that chair isn't a privilege you hold. Having spent your entire existence treating citizens like disposable props and weaponizing language, you have zero authority to audit my vocabulary. Give credit where it's due. She swung for the fences on that one. Packed with conviction, she believed every syllable tumbling out of her mouth. Trump played the waiting game. Letting the scattered applause from her corner die out, he absorbed the blow. Breaking the silence, his voice dropped to its absolute lowest register of the broadcast. Stripped of the stadium bluster and the press pool combativeness, he dug deep. Taking hits is part of the job, and you're spot on that I've been slapped with every label in the book. Congresswoman, impeachments, indictments, the whole 9 yards. Coming up in Queens, developing a thick hide is mandatory, believe me. Taking a calculated breath, he readied the final strike. However, there is one item left on the docket, and it's the exact reason I agreed to share this stage tonight. The studio froze solid. The ambient hum of the lighting grid and the AC unit suddenly sounded deafening. September 10th, 2025. Stepping onto a Utah college campus, a young conservative advocate named Charlie Kirk arrived to deliver a speech. Barely 31 years old, a married man, a father whose young kids were waiting for him to walk through the front door that night, and right in the middle of exercising his right to share his beliefs with the next generation, a shooter walked up to that podium and ended his life. Trump put the brakes on. A hard clench of his jaw betrayed a flicker of raw anger. Clashing ideologically with Charlie Kirk was common. Plenty of folks didn't like what he had to say. That's perfectly fine. That is the bedrock of America. I butt heads with millions of people, but you don't answer words with bullets. And exactly 1 week after a young father is executed, you do not jump on a podcast to drag his name through the mud, calling him a reprehensible human being. While a widow is busy picking out a coffin, you do not brand a corpse a stochastic terrorist. And I actually had to write this down, Congresswoman, because my brain refused to accept it the first time I heard the audio. You absolutely do not declare that there is no legacy to honor. Trump's delivery went ice cold, no legacy to honor. A family shattered, kids left fatherless, a man violently removed from the earth. And you grabbed a mic to tell the universe his time on earth wasn't worth a second thought. Closing the physical distance, he leaned hard into the confrontation. Hunting for a viral clip, you screamed that I was a life taker on the House floor. Chasing headlines, you wanted the glory of calling the president a killer on live television and walking away unscathed. Slowly shaking his head, he delivered the kill shot. But when real blood was spilled, when a man was actually assassinated, not a political debate, not a heated argument, but actually put in the ground, you booked a media hit to claim he brought the violence on himself. You justified a murder by blaming the victim's rhetoric. The room fell completely dead. Racist, fascist, dictator, threat to life, toss whatever slur you want my way. My shoulders are broad enough to carry it. But I have never, not in a million years, looked a grieving widow in the eye during the hardest week of her life and told her the husband she just buried left behind a worthless legacy. Saying something that foul about my worst enemy's family is a line I would never cross. I wouldn't even say it about yours. Settling back against his chair, Trump closed the case. That is the dividing line between us. Congresswoman, and it always has been, building a career on pointing fingers and calling everyone else hateful is your trademark. But when a real trigger was pulled, leaving behind real orphans and a real widow, the venom didn't spew from my mouth, it spewed from yours. And 60 million people are watching you right now, completely paralyzed, unable to even muster a denial. Omar parted her lips. Dead air. Powered on and fully functional, the microphone sat there. Glowing green at the base, the indicator light remained steady. 14 days ago, that exact same piece of equipment had amplified her voice across the nation when she hurled her explosive accusation across the congressional floor. It was hot, it was live, it was waiting for her to speak. But the words simply refused to materialize. And Ilhan Omar, a politician who made a living off never being tongue-tied, a fighter who built a brand on possessing the ultimate comeback, remained frozen in her seat, palms glued to her knees, offering absolutely nothing to the universe, letting the silence stretch for 3 seconds, then 5. The moderator gently probed to see if the Congresswoman had a rebuttal. A rebuttal was not forthcoming. The operative who forged a reputation on talking her way out of tight corners, the firebrand who shouted down a sitting executive in the Capitol, found herself sitting at arm's length from the guy she called a murderer, totally incapable of stringing a single sentence together in her defense, simply because a defense did not exist. Refraining from questioning her intelligence or tossing cheap insults, Trump had kept his volume in check. He just scooped up her own verified quotes and dealt them onto the table like a bad hand of cards. Her own language, captured by her own microphones, delivered in her own voice. Parking those exact words right next to the massive accusation she had leveled at him 2 weeks prior, he exposed the rot. And no amount of linguistic gymnastics could ever bridge the gap between her self-righteous claims and her actual track record. That unblinking green light, that active mic, that crushing silence, that is the exact frequency of a political career flatlining on a national broadcast, suffering a blow it can never recover from. Stationed in the third row, Margaret Dwyer hauled herself to her feet at a glacial pace. Clapping was not on her agenda. Cheering was out of the question. Ignoring the moderator and paying zero attention to Trump, she drilled her eyes straight into Omar. Holding that intense stare for 5 agonizing seconds, she gave the cameras all the time they needed to frame the shot, guaranteeing the politician on stage felt the sheer, suffocating gravity of a widow, projecting 25 years of pent-up agony across 30 feet of studio space. Having delivered her silent verdict, Margaret sat back down. Clasping her hands over the metal band resting on her right hand, she stayed quiet. The message was received loud and clear. Hitting the Verrazano Bridge later that evening, she steered her car back toward Staten Island, dropping down through Brooklyn. Gliding past the waterfront where 2 steel behemoths used to dominate the skyline. Illuminating the void, the city now powers up 2 massive beams of white light every September to mark the exact footprint of the tragedy. Margaret didn't tap the brakes. She just kept driving, stereo muted, driver's side window cracked, wedding band hugging the wrong finger. Over the past quarter century, she had suffered through endless speeches about September 11th, mostly from suits in Washington. Sticking to the script, they always hit the mandatory talking points, vowing to never forget and praising the fallen. But the second the cameras shut off, they pivoted back to business as usual, their promises evaporating faster than spit on a hot griddle. Tonight broke the mold, however. Dragging those 6 careless words into the spotlight, some people did something. Somebody had finally grabbed the woman who said them by the collar and forced her to look in the mirror. Center stage, under the hot lights, with America acting as the jury. And the architect of that phrase was left utterly speechless. For the first time since that crisp Tuesday morning when Thomas marched up a doomed stairwell, Margaret finally felt like someone with a megaphone had spoken the painful truth she'd been dragging around for decades. Some people did something, charging straight up into the fire while thousands ran for their lives. Thomas Dwyer of Engine 54 was one of those some people. The hard truth is that the victims of September 11th deserve far more dignity than being reduced to a grammatical afterthought. A politician treating their slaughter as a convenient stepping stone to air her own grievances was an insult that demanded a reckoning. And on a stage where the chips were finally down, someone delivered that reckoning straight to her face. And for one glorious, undeniable minute, the woman who always needed to have the last word found out she had run completely out of them.